I'm Alexis, and welcome to the Whatcha Watchin podcast. Today, we have a very special episode because we are joined by award-winning author Byron Graves to talk about movie adaptations. Byron, thank you so much for being here. And, do you want to tell the people a little bit about yourself?
I am a debut author. My new book, Rez Ball, came out this past September. It recently won the William C. Morris Award for debut author, and it also won the American Indian Literature Award for young adult books, which comes out biennially. So it was really an honor to win something that only comes out once every 2 years. So yeah, it's been doing really well. The Audible is amazing. If you're more of an Audible person like myself, where you'd rather listen to it while you're at the gym or driving or hanging out, but yeah, I'm honored to be here. Big fan of your show. I catch a lot of the TikTok snippets, and it always gets me thinking and excited to see new films. So, big fan of what you do, Alexis.
Thank you so much. Well, I'm so psyched because I've known Byron for a bazillion years, way back in the early Twitter days, and just to follow your writing journey and see the success you've had on this book just makes me so happy for you. So I am thrilled that you're here, and I'm thrilled that we're going to talk about page to screen adaptations today. So we
Me
can
too.
just yeah, we could just jump right in, and we'll just start with like, what do you think are some really good movie adaptations? What stands out to you as some of the best page to screen adaptations that you have read or watched or both?
There's a few different things that come to mind when I think about like a book to film adaptation or book to any different multimedia adaptation. One of them, and I think this is what a lot of people get hung up on, is how true was it to the original? Did they change a lot of stuff? Did they leave a lot of stuff out? Anytime you hear book fans talk about the film version or the TV version, that's usually one of their biggest hangups is what got left out, what they did do, what they if they changed something. It's like and then there are people who never read the book who are experiencing it for the first time, and they don't have any of that to worry about. And then to them, the movie's either good or not good. So to me, there's that aspect of it, and then the other aspect of it is did the version that came out next, the second iteration of it, you take it from a book to that a movie, did they do something new that accentuated what was great about the book? Did they lift something up? Did they exaggerate something in a beautiful way? And so for me, like one of my favorites, and you might see someone like the spooky posters, they're the old Universal horror movie stuff behind me. I think it was incredible that almost 100 years ago, they took Bram Stoker's Dracula and made it into a movie that 100 years later people still watch around Halloween, and it spawned an entire genre of film. So like that's in my list that I would say just because of how game changing it was and how long ago. And it's a masterful movie. Dracula, Bela Lugosi in it was acting on a different level. You could see a lot of the other people in that film were like still acting like they weren't, because film was such a new medium at the time. They were still acting the way you would on stage, and they were over the top with things and kind of almost goofy with things. And Bela Lugosi in that film was like just an award-winning, like just you look at just his face and the way they lit his face and the movement of the camera, the still of the camera, just a beautiful poetic genius film. And so Bram Stoker's Dracula is one of my favorites, right there with Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. The same
Nice.
for all the same reasons. But to go modern, Fight Club, I think is one of my all-time favorites. And the reason why is because it's really hard, I think, to translate a first person point of view where everything, all like 85% of the book you're reading happens internally.
For
And
sure.
Fight Club, is it David Fincher who shot
Yes.
Fight Club?
Mhm.
Yeah. He was able to shoot that in a way where there's a lot of narration in it. Edward Norton's character is constantly talking, doing a voiceover as you're watching things or in between things, and that's all pulled from the book. So they like took what was great about Chuck Palahniuk's writing and actually had it come across. And it's one of the only films I've ever seen that like pulled both and had both together, and then like I said, did something new with it, something beautiful with it, something that like pulled it out and made me as a fan of the book even bigger fan of the movie.
For sure. Yeah, I think it's really rare to capture kind of like the vibe of a book in a film. You can get like the narrative, you can get the characters, but David Fincher's like just visual style even really lends itself to the kind of like tone of that book. And so I think in a way it's like it's such an interesting combination of like an author and a filmmaker in a way that just really works and really comes together well. And that movie also just felt really revolutionary at the time too, because they were doing a lot of things in there that were just like so different and so interesting that we hadn't really seen in kind of adaptations up to that point. I mean, even just kind of the self-awareness of like, Tyler putting in the frames of pornography and then putting in the frames of Tyler in the thing. Like, what an interesting thing to make a comment about. Like, you can see this in book form, but now we can see it in a film in a way that really translates. It's so interesting. Yeah, I think Fight Club such a good choice for this. Absolutely.
Yeah, the cinematography, the lighting, the way that they edited certain sequences. I think like I'm a huge fan of like 1980s like punk rock, and I think when you can have because Chuck Palahniuk's Fight Club, the writing of it's very punk rock. Like so many of the lines could be a punk rock title of a song or one of the most memorable lines of a song, um, and to have that energy and that vibe translate into what you're seeing in a visual media perspective was just it was mind blowing to me to like be able to see that get pulled off in both those different directions. And I know because I've heard him do a couple of interviews about it. Chuck Palahniuk being there, like being able to be on set and being able to like take part in things or just say, "Hey, I loved this," or maybe we could do this with that. Having a little bit of that collaboration between the author of something and then the filmmaker of it,
For
I think
sure.
probably helped in those minuscule, the nuances, those little things.
Fight Club is so interesting too because I feel like it was like the kind of message of that. When you look at like dudes online who unironically think Tyler Durden is like the greatest guy and like they're like, "Yeah, dude, we should all be Tyler Durden." It's like I think you might be missing the point a little bit. And I know he said that about the book. I know he said that about the movie. It's almost like they made a movie that was too cool and people were like, "Oh, this is too cool. I can't see the satire in this. I can't see the like you see Brad Pitt in that cool leather jacket and you're like, "Dude, that's the guy." And it's like, "Yeah, but you're not quite getting the like actual point of this." So I think that's really interesting too when you adapt something and it's kind of like are people missing the point of the original work because the adaptation is like just too cool?
And I think that happens with like words to different mediums. Like sometimes when you listen to a song, for example, you can be singing along, or you can think the aesthetic of the band or the music video or something that you saw was really cool. But it can go. I've seen some people who are like fans of System of a Down who are like the complete opposite of everything System of a Down stands for, or the same thing with like Rage Against the Machine. I've seen certain people come to light with having these epiphanies that they actually hate Rage Against the Machine because they finally, like, now that they're 40 years old, read the lyrics or like figured out what it was about. So some of that stuff does get lost in translation, and I think Fight Club is an example of a lot of the fanboys of it or a lot of the stands of it, if you will, are the complete opposite of like the underlying theme of that movie, which was kind of more of like an introspection, kind of more anarchist, kind of just like who are you and what truly matters. That's what I walked away from the book
Totally.
and the movie with was like maybe be a little more introspective.
Yeah, for sure. It's very like, hey, we're going to kind of make fun of toxic masculinity. And then a bunch of toxic masculine dudes went like, this is our Bible now. And it's like, okay, I think you may have maybe missed the point here.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's one of the reasons why, like, when I was thinking of, like, anytime I think of, lists of anything and anytime I think of Fight Club, it's one of those things that I almost wanna leave off just for those reasons,
Oh, for
but
sure.
I've also, like, thought about this for even though this was a fantastic question, I've thought a lot about how hard that was, like I was saying earlier, to pull across the source material and
Yeah,
bring it to life on the screen. Otherwise, like, you just have an audible book. So
so true.
how do you move it one level higher and actually have the visual representation happening? What's your favorite?
I feel like, it's a cliche answer, but I feel like Lord of the Rings kills it, like to me it's one of those things. I remember I watched the first movie and then I tore through all the books. And I before the second movie came out, and I was just like, man, this is amazing. It's such a beautiful, like, kind of just like captures the vibe but also hits the story points. And I thought it was interesting when you're talking about, like, what like people that are really faithful to the book are always upset about whatever gets cut. And I remember the Tom Bombadil situation. People were like, yeah, but like, where's Tom Bombadil? It's like, you don't really need it. We already have kind of a thing going on here. So I thought there were some really interesting choices there with kind of what to keep, what to shorten. Cause I mean, when you have a gigantic book series, you have unlimited time and unlimited resources and unlimited everything. And then you kind of have to think about, as a filmmaker, how do I do this in a way that's not going to cost like $80 billion and that's not going to be like 17 hours per movie? So I think that's a really when you have something that's so epic like that, that's to me so hard to then take and squeeze into like a 3 hour movie. And even with the extended editions, it's like that's really hard to do. So I love that. I think that's a really good one. I feel like the first Hunger Games and the first Hunger Games movie, I think, are pretty like faithful adaptations of each other. Like, I mean, there's a lot of them where we got into this very like YA apocalypse kind of like thing, and it was like there were some that you could see where maybe the first movie and the first book, it was like, yes, okay, and then it started to get a little more nonsense and a little more crazy and a little more convoluted, and a lot of the time the books do that too, but the movies, it started to feel much more like Hollywood product than an adaptation of a story.
Yeah, they have those little pockets of time where something blows up and then it's the big it thing. And I kind of compare it to Gremlins. There's always like the cute, beautiful little gizmo. And then there's all of the gremlins, all of the ones where you're like, oh my God. Um, and that you see that time and time again, whether it's music or film or whatever, there's always the front runner and then there's all the copycats and then they're so bad that nobody wants them anymore.
So
Um,
true.
but to go back to Lord of the Rings, I think one of the reasons why that was such a brilliant translation was because Peter Jackson he was such a huge fan of the work, and it meant so much to him, and it was in his heart, it was in his creative mind of like, how can I do those two things I was talking about, stay true to the source material, honor the source material, but then do something new with it, something bigger,
Absolutely.
yeah, something
Yeah.
fresh, something exciting. And so like sometimes I think director gets handed a script and they want to direct. It's what they do for work. They want to do their thing, which I don't blame them for. But maybe they weren't a fan of the material. Maybe they hadn't read it before, and now it's on their desk. So now they're going backwards and reading the book, versus somebody who grew up reading it, was in love with it, was a fan of it, and now they get to put their spin on it.
For sure. I think one of the most interesting things, like when I look at Denis Villeneuve talking about Dune, like he's so into it. And it's one of those things where, like, I haven't read it. I know it's like fully crazy. And like everybody that I know that's read it is like, dude, some wild shit happens in this. But I'm like, it's so cool that for me, a person who hasn't read it, I can watch that movie and I can, like, I don't need to have read it. Like, I don't, it's like, I know it's going to get weird, but he knows how to kind of like ease me into that. He knows all the weirdness and he's like, I'll get you there. But for now, let me show you this. So, and I think he's such a
Yeah.
cool visual director too, that I think he's like, when you're doing something that's like that level of like elevated sci fi where you need like world building on that scale, he's such the right guy for that. So, that to me is another one where I'm like, I haven't read the book, so I don't necessarily know if it's like a great adaptation of the book, but I know that I really liked that movie and I'm really looking forward to Dune Part 2.
I joined my very first book club during like the pandemic, and the first book was Dune, and I had never read Dune, and so I went and got the book. I got about 50 pages in, and I had to leave the book club. Like I had to tap out. It wasn't like I had been in the book club through 7 books, and I was like, "This one's not the one." It was embarrassing because the very first book of the book club I couldn't hang with because I was 50 or 60 pages in, and I had no clue what I had read, and I was
Totally.
rereading the same. So it was very information dense, and there was a lot of stuff happening. And like that, I'm a fan of like character driven,
Totally.
young adult books where I'm like, okay, this guy fell in love with the girl out of his league. Now what?
Yeah.
Like I'm a fan of those tropes, and I can follow that. And then it's how well did they write it and whatnot. But Dune was like info overload for me. So
Oh, I'm
the
sure.
movies work better, because I can see the 7 things that happen, and I can follow
Right.
those 7 things. Yeah,
It's so true. It's such a good like that's such a good point too about when you are like adapting something from a book. Like you can have a book that's really dense or has so much going on and you have to figure out how to translate that into like maybe 3 hours for an audience that wants like a narrative story. Especially when you're talking about something of that level where it's like hundreds of millions of dollars budget, like it has to play to an audience that's going to see like, the new Captain America movie. So like how do
yeah,
you how do you balance these two things of like, elevated sci-fi, intense world building. There's like, sandworms and, this whole like the Harkonnens and like it's just like that seems so challenging. So the very fact that that movie exists and is not terrible is kind of a miracle to me.
I think, with, your other favorite that was Hunger Games,
Hmm.
I think that as a as a person newer to the literary world and working with a publishing company and editors, there was things that I had never fathomed from a creative standpoint when you're thinking like, I'm going to write a book and I'm going to have these characters and this is what's going to happen to the characters and here's the voice and style of it. Here's my vision, here's what I want to do. In a book, you're thinking, well, it's just me writing this book. And at first that is true. But then once I got into the machine, if you will, I have the best team, I have the best editors, the best publishing company. They shared my vision. And they allowed me to tell the story I wanted to tell, and they helped me like figure out how to do that. But my point is that the things that I hadn't thought about were like how the publishing company and editors are looking at this through the lens of like, who is your audience? Where do we see this in like longevity wise, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years? And how I had to turn on a couple of filters to make that work from a like, whether it was to make it for a broader audience or make it more understandable or palpable. And some of those things that I don't want to say lose, but some of the things that fall off. So you have the book version that goes through that set of filters for whatever reasons. Then you move it over to the film, and like with Hunger Games, maybe it did start off with here's the book and here's the movie, and like let's make those two connect. But then it became a huge blockbuster, right? So as you
Totally.
get further down the road, and the studio is like, hey, here's what's hot right now, here's what's coming out next, here's what just made $1 billion at the box office.
For
Can we
sure.
start to make this align with those movies?
So
And
true. Yeah.
I've heard that a lot from directors is how much the studio comes into play with your artistic vision of something. So you have so many hands in the pot.
Yeah, that's such a good point about kind of the creative process between books and screen. I think like, when you have a book, you have an author, and for the most part, like you said, there are compromises, there are things you need to think about. For the most part though, it's like you have an author's vision when you have a book. You have a person who sat down and wrote the book. And yes, you may have editors or you may have people saying, actually, this is not going to be that accessible to an audience or, this might not play that well. But for the most part, it's kind of a singular vision. And then when you get into film, you get into such a collaborative process where, yes, your director is, the driving force, but it's like your director and your writer may be different. Your VFX people may be different. Your costume designer, everybody, like every single person is going to have a different sort of thing that they bring to it, including your actors. So it does become this really interesting collaborative thing where you do kind of lose the singular vision in the way that you have in a book, but you can still kind of have like a synthesized vision in a way that's really interesting. And sometimes I feel like you can see where that really comes together and works. And then other times you're like, wow, okay, we had a lot of conflicting ideas going on here between like the director and the studio and the writers. And like, oh, okay, this was a big old mess. So yeah, I think like what an interesting whenever we talk about adaptations from books, it is really hard to translate it over because you are dealing with like a person who wrote this and then like a collective of entire, companies and groups of people that have to try to like bring this out.
Yeah, you had a post recently. I think I came across it. I can't remember if it was a Instagram reel or on TikTok. But you were talking about how as it was coming to the year end award time, so you have these lists, right? And that's like the it thing is to like, here's my list of the best. And then I think your point was, and this might jog your memory, and you might know what post I'm talking about. You might be able to help me out with getting the rest of it across. But your point of like, I didn't want to do a worst of this because to what you were just saying, there's so many people that work on a film that did a brilliant job with like the
Totally.
set design, with the costumes. Maybe there was a brilliant acting in it. So to like trash something when there was like hundreds of people who did a bunch of little tiny beautiful things is kind of like another like concept that I think about all the time when someone tells me they hated a movie.
Yeah.
And I'm
Oh,
like,
for sure.
everything? They'll be like, well, I didn't like the way it ended. And I'm like, but what about the million other
Yeah.
things that were part of that film? Yeah.
Such a good example of that to me, I think, is the final season of Game of Thrones. Like, I hated where they went with it in terms of the writing. But then they released that little documentary thing right after it aired that was like, here are all the like artisans and these people who have like painstakingly made costumes and makeup and set design. And you just sort of felt like, well, I'm going to blame this on the writing because everybody else did their job. You know, like everybody else was doing what they could here. And it's like more, I'm disappointed by the narrative of this and where that went. But like costume department, you kicked ass. Music, you kicked ass. You know what I mean? It's like everybody was doing the right thing. It's just the narrative. It was in service of such a shit narrative in that final season that you're just like, no, all these talented people and for this, you know? So yeah, to me, that's such a good example. I mean, that might even work for like, I know it's not a movie, but like for both best adaptations and worst adaptations, you know? It's like
Right, right,
started
right.
out amazing, just completely turned to crap by the end where you're like, "Oh no, like I can't believe this beautiful thing that was going so well just failed so spectacularly in the end." But everybody else did their job. Just the writing was the disappointing part.
Like Game of Thrones, the TV show, reminds me in a way on a macro level of like any horror, almost any horror film ever. There's like a cool beginning, there's a premise to it, you're along for the ride, you're eating your popcorn, and by the ending, you're like, that was the end. Like this open ended, like I don't even know what happened. Like they didn't know how to end
Totally.
it. So now I'm walking away from this horror film being like, it started pretty cool.
Oh, totally. That's the most disappointing when you're like, okay, you've got a great idea. I'm along for the ride. And then it's like, oh, it just like either fizzles out or it just like completely turns awful. Or there's like a plot twist that you're like, but that doesn't make any sense. Like you haven't set that up at all. And it's like, ah, yes, the
Yeah.
disappointing, like, third act of something.
So as a horror film fan and as a Minnesota sports fan, like the Vikings, Timberwolves, those teams, I I didn't mind the end of Game of Thrones because it was comforting to me because that's how I'm used to everything I love ending just really badly.
Yeah, you're like, I'm just used to disappointment at this point.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what I'm comfortable with.
Yeah, I would have been confused if it would have ended amazing. I'd have been like, I didn't like
Well, that's a good
that.
way to transition to our sort of worst adaptations or adaptations that you feel like maybe missed the mark or didn't quite get across, kind of what you were hoping for. What do you think are some that just maybe didn't translate well, or maybe they translated well, but the movie, the idea wasn't that great in the first place, or something along those lines?
Going back to the same reasons why I thought um, Chuck Palahniuk's Fight Club book and then the movie worked so well would also be another one of his. And I think sometimes too, what comes into play with whether it's a book you're waiting for or a concert you're excited to go to or a film you're waiting to see is your expectations, what you had seen previously and now what you hope to see again. And so I had back in like the 90s, aging myself a little bit, back in the 90s when I was in like high school, and Fight Club came out, I thought that was one of the coolest looking movies I had ever seen. And it inspired me to go read the book. So I read the book and loved the book just as much. So I started to read Palahniuk. And I was like, when's there going to be like Fight Club 2? When are we going to see that, what that happened again? And what year did Show come out? Like in the early
2008.
2000s? Yeah, 2008. I had waited almost 10 years to see another Polinick film, so my expectations were maybe a little too high. But Choke, it just maybe for the same reason where like there's that internal narrative and a lot of the information is inside the head of a character, and that seemed like more of a film where they tried to make this stuff happen externally as much as
Totally.
possible. So there was a lot left on the table, and it just became just a movie. I didn't see the Chuck
Yes.
Palahniuk magic happening.
Completely agree. Yeah, I remember being so bummed by that because I had read the book and I thought it was so great. And then they were like, they're going to turn this into a movie. I was so excited because I thought, like, I was like you, like, oh man, Fight Club, what a great movie to, to translation. And then I was like, oh, this is going to be great. It's going to be just like that. And then I remember when Choke came out, I just was like, there are so many really talented people in this, and it just completely fell flat for me. It was missing that, like, there's like a humor to his work, there's like a smart assness to his work, and it just felt like it was just like missing all of that. It was kind of like, well, you're saying the words, or like you're hitting the scenes or whatever. You have the characters, but there's nothing like behind it in the way that there was in the book. It just felt so like empty compared to the book. And I remember that was one of the early ones where I was like, man, this just like really bums me out. You know? Like,
Yeah, and like with Polnick specifically, like so much of his what's beautiful about his writing is the wordplay, it is the line, it is the writing, like how he says something is the magic. It's not just like his idea of section A to section B to section B, this character did this and then this happened. That's not what's really great about his writing. His writing is like it's like reading a poem. So it would be like taking your favorite song and then removing the lyrics and the vocals and then just
yeah.
having just the instrumental. You're like, where are the words? Where's the message?
Yes.
Yeah. So
Totally.
and it would still probably be okay. Like I would listen to Nirvana instrumental, but you know, you want to hear like
But it's
Kurt
not
Cobain's
quite the
lyrics.
same. Yeah,
Right,
exactly.
right. Yeah.
It's like it
So
might still be pretty, but you're not going to get the impact that you would if you really had like the full kind of experience with it.
So for me, I guess like I was talking about how people say, well, this scene didn't happen or that scene didn't happen, and that's usually what they don't like. For me, as a fan of like music and a fan of poetry and all of those different like aspects and aesthetics to those, I like seeing that come through somehow. And so with Choke, I just felt like that didn't come across.
It's interesting, like when I think about adaptations, I feel like The Shining always kind of comes up. And it's one of those things where it's like, it's such a well regarded movie. And I think it's like a masterpiece in terms of just like every aspect of the filmmaking is like working correctly. And then it's interesting when you see like, oh, Stephen King hated it. Like he thought it was a terrible adaptation. He didn't like it. And it's so like, that's also that disconnect too between like, well, the author kind of has this thing in mind. And then like the filmmaker has this thing in mind. And it's like, in this case, it's like, I don't know, that movie's pretty awesome. So like, Stephen King's great, but that movie's pretty awesome.
Yeah, it's hard to fathom having, as an author, having a film be like critically renowned and just acclaimed. Every of your fans loved it, right? So then, but you still being held up, or you know, not liking it for whatever reason about something you wanted to have come across. My wildest dream if Stanley Kubrick and then fans and critics all loved something and you left my favorite scene out, I wouldn't care.
Yeah, exactly. You're like, there's only so upset you could be if you have this like amazing interpretation of your work. You're like, well, I'm not going to be too mad about it. Like, it's
Even
cool.
just like
I'll get over it.
quick, super quick. Even with like writing a book, I've had complete scenes, scene 23 that I had spent like a year working on and writing that I knew why that scene mattered and what it said and how it like showed you a little something more about that character or that character's life. And we go back and forth editing, 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 and they're telling me what they don't like about it, what they don't like, maybe what they do like. And by the time if the dislikes are like 80% to the 20% of, hey, we like these aspects of it, I've taken some scenes and I've just completely deleted them because I'm like, you guys clearly don't like it. Something's not working. There's a disconnect. I no longer am emotionally attached to my scenes. Like if the editors have that much of an issue with something, I'm like, that can go bye bye. There's still like a million other things we're working on in this book. I don't get caught up or hung up on a line of dialogue or an entire scene. I'll throw an entire scene in the trash bucket. Like I'm quick to just say, hey, you know what? You
That's
guys have done this a long time. It's a collaborative effort.
totally.
If something doesn't work, let's just let it go. And you know
That's
that.
such a good place to be at creatively too, because I think it's hard, like creative people, we get attached, we get precious about certain things we do. And it's like, when you have something where you're like, yeah, but I really like this and I'm really attached to it. And then you have all these people that are not you, that are like not in your head, that are like, right, but I don't think that's working for anyone besides you,
Right,
And
right.
then it's hard to be like, oh, all right. So yeah, that's a very good place to be at where you're like, you know what? I'm not going to be too attached to this. I'm gonna sort of listen to feedback and I'm gonna know that this is a collaboration. And like you said, like if if most of what you want to get across gets across, then you're like, I could probably lose this scene or whatever. I think
Right.
filmmakers, it's very much the same way. Like the editing process is so hard because there are so many things. I mean, you'll hear about this all the time where they're like, yeah, we shot this scene, but we didn't include it. Or back in the DVD days, it was always like, I would go through the deleted scenes and I would say like, oh, I wonder why they cut that out. But inevitably, like when you watch those deleted scenes, you're like, no, I get why they cut that out. It's tough, but sometimes you're like, no, that is the right call, like
Yeah.
you did need to chop it.
Yeah, part of that collaborative effort of trusting, like, each person has their own job, and you gotta let the editor do their job. So that happens in between the two, of course, from the book to film adaptation, all those different hands in the pot. And then, like, what the author gets to have, like, final say, or do they can they not say a thing about the film? Do they get to collaborate somewhat on the outcome of the film or the creative process of it? So that's another contract that happens along the way between the two too. A lot of times I'm assuming the author has no say. They sign off like, yeah, I want my book to be a movie. Who doesn't? And maybe then that's it though. Like you're taking
Totally.
the material and now it's yours. You purchased it,
Yeah.
and then some higher end maybe authors with a little more pull, with a little more clout can say, well, actually I want to have some say. But I'm sure that's hard to get in the contract.
Oh yeah. I always think that was such an interesting thing to me about both Twilight and 50 Shades was like the level of involvement from the authors. And obviously those are like ginormous books, so they get to kind of throw around some power and be like, I'm going to have like a final say here or whatever. But it's sometimes where you're like, you shouldn't,
Yeah.
like 50 Shades in particular is where you almost want to just be like, you should let filmmakers make the film.
I like to ask people who are being critical about something what they would have done different or better with that source material. Like, okay, here's your
Totally.
source material. You didn't like the movie. What would you do different or better? And sometimes you're like, I guess that was just going to be what it was, you
Yeah,
know?
exactly. That's one where you're like, what could you improve? And it's like, well, you could just not write it in the first place.
I have to say, I glanced through 50 Shades when it was like the biggest thing in the world, and you could get it for like $2 at Goodwill because there had been a billion printed at
Yes.
that point. So I skimmed through some of it, and it was early on in my writing journey, and it definitely inspired me in a way to say, like, you know what, I could do this too.
Yes,
You know?
yes, totally.
Yeah.
That to me is the biggest value of that like entire franchise is where you go like it's like there was a Curb Your Enthusiasm episode where Larry David was talking about art and he goes, "Is it art if I could do it? Like if I could do it, is it art?" And I feel like that was to me 50 Shades. And I think for so many people started writing after that because everybody kind of read that and was like, "Well, I could do that." Like that doesn't seem hard. All right, I'll write a novel, like so I guess in that sense, good on her for inspiring so many people to like try their hand at doing something creative.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, I wouldn't be here without 50 Shades. That's my biggest mission, if I can get that same message across. I always tell people, "Hey, look at me. If I did this, you can do it too." I say that every time I go speak, anytime I'm speaking with children. I'm like, "If I did it, you can, I promise."
Okay, what about let's talk about casting of things because I know, like I don't know about you, but when I was writing books, I always kind of had actors in mind or I had kind of like a visualization of someone in mind whenever I was writing these characters. And I wonder too, like with actors where they're like, I really wanted this person, but they couldn't do it, so we got this person. What do you think are some good castings and maybe some not so great castings or surprising castings where you're like, wow, this wasn't how I pictured this, but it ended up really working out?
Going back to Dune, like Timothy Chalamet, he's one of those people that, as an actor, it's just there's like a nuance in everything he does. There's like the look in his eyes. There's the movement of him. He's just to me, he can be captivating, like doing nothing. So with like
Completely
something
agree.
like Dune, where I like the book was too much information for me. Dune, even in its subtle moments with Timothy Chalamet in it, is something that like can captivate me, keep me watching, keep me engaged, take make me forget that I'm watching a movie, which to me is always a sign of brilliant directing, brilliant acting. Is like I forget for a second that I'm watching a movie that's based on a book and I'm not scrutinizing anything and I'm just living in the moment. So I think that he's somebody that like can bring that to the table and almost anything I've seen him in. He's just brilliant. What was the movie? It was called Call Me by My Name.
Yeah, call me by your name. So
Yeah,
good.
brilliant, brilliant acting, brilliant film. That was one of the first things I saw him in, and I've been a huge fan of his ever since. I might be a little biased in choosing him as like one of my best book to film casting adaptations, but just a brilliant actor.
That's you can be as biased as you want because I am so pro Chalamet. I just like I think he's like one of the most impressive young actors. I find him so he's so like compelling. His face really reads. He's able to do so much through subtlety. To me, I think of him and Adam Driver as these two actors where whatever they're in, like I'll watch it. I mean, like the ending of Call Me by Your Name is seriously just like a 7-minute shot of Timothy Chalamet's face with the credits rolling, and he is giving so much emotion and like so much like through that just this close up of him that it's like that's amazing to me. So yeah, I'm with you. Like I think so much can be conveyed by an actor just through their performance that you get some of those like subtext things, or you get maybe some like narrative things that, you know, in a book you'd be able to be in the character's head hearing their thoughts. And it's like to be able to do that in a way that's like silent or just through your eyes or through your expression, such a skill. So great choice.
He is in my home state right now of Minnesota, researching. He's going to be Bob Dylan in an upcoming film. So he was actually in like Duluth the last couple of days doing research for it, going around to different places Bob Dylan grew up. So like nerd me, who like Minnesota never has anything. We had like Purple Rain. That's it. So like I'm so excited to see another like Minnesota anything on screen, and then to have one of my favorite actors embodying it. I can't wait. I'm so excited to see what he does with that role.
I think another like a surprising casting for me was Jennifer Lawrence in Hunger Games. I think when I read Hunger Games, that was not really what I was picturing. And then when I saw the first Hunger Games movie, I was like, no, she killed it. She did a great job. Like, but it is interesting too when you kind of have, especially when you have something that where like, there's such descriptions of the characters. A lot of the time, main characters are kind of purposely a little generic. But I feel like with that, I was like, no, I have a total picture of this girl in my mind. And then when they announced Jennifer Lawrence, I was like, huh, okay, interesting, but I think it really worked. That was one that surprised me in a good way, and I was kind of like, oh, all right, that translated nicely.
So going back to being like that person who's picking apart the book and then judging what's on the screen. Initially, when I was reading Hunger Games, I was picturing Katniss Everdeen to be an indigenous character, maybe a Native American character. I think she was kind of described as having like olive skin and dark hair, and the setting, the like districts being stuck on a district, especially like one of the poorest districts where they were basically starving and couldn't leave, reminded me a lot of like a Native American reservation. So in my mind, as I was envisioning and creating, because that's the beautiful thing about a book is you are in charge of being the cinematographer, the director, the set designer, the costume designer. So in my mind, as I was making this world up for the first time, I was picturing like a Native American reservation and a Native American actress. And I think now we're getting into that point where we do see Native American representation not only in literature but also on screen. Like we have Echo on Disney Plus right now. Reservation Dogs was incredible.
Lily
So we're starting
Gladstone,
to
who we
see,
keep our fingers crossed that she will win an Oscar. I want her to win
right?
so bad. It's like I know she probably won't, but God, I want her to so bad.
Just to have the opportunity to be in a Scorsese film alongside Leonardo DiCaprio. So, and it's just brilliant. I'm so excited for her. Just to be nominated is so like she's the
For
first
sure.
Native American woman to be nominated for something like that. So fingers crossed for Lily Gladstone. But so now we are finally getting into that world where you can see Native American representation on screen, especially like a big budget anything, not just like some small indie role with some tiny character. So I think now, like if Hunger Games took place today and it had never been made and now it's being made, maybe we would see a young Native American actress. Or a person of color playing that role. But maybe that was just my interpretation of it, because that's the other thing with like writing is you do leave some to the imagination and you sprinkle pieces of information and then the reader gets to say, hey, here's what I pictured. But Jennifer Lawrence in that film was amazing. Like I loved her. Once I saw the movie, I like went, oh, hey, that wasn't what I expected for the first like 7 seconds. But then as soon as she started moving, talking, her bravery, she was another one who she has a line, right? A line of dialogue, but then how she says it, she's able to say things with like a certain like a certain strength, a certain like you believe, like you're like, holy crap, I'm not messing with that girl. And it doesn't seem forced. So I thought she did an incredible job. I loved Hunger Games. I loved her performance in it.
Yeah, it's interesting. I wonder, now that like a movie like Prey that came out, and I think like that to me is almost like such a good example of like that's a very almost like Katniss kind of character. And it's like I wonder too. I think that's a good point about like have we moved now to a point where it's like, well, we could have that, like we could just be like, and that's Hunger Games now. And I love, as these adaptations, as we get, further down the line with things, we do get less tied to like this character has to be a certain race, this character has to be a certain whatever. It's kind of like, well, what kind of fits the vibe, what fits the role? Like, it could be anybody. And I think like, like you were saying, when you read a book, you cast the people in your brain yourself. You are all those, the casting director and the cinematographer. And I think we're getting to the point where it is less tied to this character is this specific thing and more like, well, this character is kind of this type of person, or like this is the vibe we want from that. And I think like I love that. I think that's cool because it makes it where you really can get a difference between book to screen, in a way where it's an interpretation of the book more so than like an exact, replica of the book.
Yeah, so many of those like subtleties do add into then when you are trying to take 300 pages and squeeze them into 2 hours, 2.5 hours, 3 hours of a movie. How do you get all of that across? And I think sometimes casting can have that where nobody has to say a thing, but you're like, oh, that person or that type of person is the actor or actress in it. Okay, go. Now
Totally.
I've already got some underlying thoughts about the visual representation I'm seeing on screen and how that
Absolutely.
impacts all those other variables of a film or a book.
Well, who would you cast if you were going to cast? Who would be like your dream lead actor? Like if you wanted somebody to betray, like who's the person that you're like, man, right now if they're making this movie tomorrow, here's who I wish was in it.
Um, if I could take a time machine, and go back just a little bit, there's an actor that I've pictured being like my main character for a long time. He's an indigenous actor named Gordon Kiowa. He is who I've always like been writing with in mind, as I've had to be like, okay, well, how would this character move, turn, talk? What's their facial expressions? So I pull a lot from his acting into like my main characters. But I think
Awesome.
there's so many like brilliant young indigenous actors now. Like when I watch like Reservation Dogs, I see so many kids who could easily betray and
So
be my
cool.
main character and the characters in that. Netflix has a version of Rez Ball from a different author who wrote a different book. We share the same title. So the people at Netflix and the people producing that show, and then the people at HarperCollins were like, "Hey, can we share this title? They're similar, but can we share it?" So there actually will be a Rez Ball Netflix series. It's done. I think it's just on its way to actually pop up on screen now. But I'm really
Awesome.
excited. It's from the people who did Reservation Dogs, Sterling Harjo, which I'm a huge fan of. So I'm excited to see who they've cast and how they go about their version. So I will get to
Very cool.
see something pretty close to
So
what I was
awesome.
telling on screen. So that's pretty
So
exciting in its
cool.
own way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. Really awesome. I want a major motion picture made of your book. I just, I'm like team Byron Graves, so I just like want all the things for you.
I
So
think with everything we said, I think the one I'm working on now, my next one that comes out this coming fall, that's the one that I can see translating to screen for a lot of different reasons. So I'm excited to see if I did one that someone else can see and be like, oh, hey, this would be a great film or TV series. So I've got my fingers crossed. So
awesome. Well, we will keep our fingers crossed for you as
yeah.
well. Well, thank you so much, Byron. This was just like so lovely. And I'm so glad we could talk about all these things. And I'm sure we'll chat again when your next book comes out. Will you let everybody know where they can find you on social? Where can they find your book? Everybody go buy it and read it and get the audiobook too and do the whole thing. Byron, where can people find you?
Yeah, I'm a social media freak, so I'm on there all day. Instagram, X, Threads, Facebook. So if you Google search Byron Graves, you'll find any of those. My link tree is a great spot to start. Byron Graves link tree. You can find everything right there.
Awesome. Well, we will put links in the description for all the things, and I encourage everybody to go check out Rez Ball. Byron, thank you again so much for being here. This was so lovely.
Thank you, Alexis. I had a great time chatting.